You didn't choose to be born into this. You didn't ask for parents who would see you not as a person to love and nurture, but as an extension of themselves, a mirror to reflect their own grandiosity, or a scapegoat for their failures. Yet here you are, perhaps years into adulthood, still trying to untangle the web of confusion, self-doubt, and emotional wounds that narcissistic parenting has woven through your psyche. Understanding how narcissistic parents systematically break down their children isn't just an academic exercise, it's a crucial step toward healing. When you can name what happened to you, when you can see the patterns and mechanisms of psychological manipulation that shaped your early years, you begin to reclaim pieces of yourself that were buried under layers of gaslighting, emotional neglect, and conditional love. The foundation of broken trust. Your relationship with your parents was supposed to be your first lesson in trust, safety, and unconditional love. Instead, narcissistic parents turn this foundational relationship into a masterclass in psychological manipulation. From your earliest memories, you learned that love was conditional, that your worth was tied to your usefulness, and that your reality could be questioned and dismissed at any moment. Attachment theory, developed by psychologist John Bowlby, explains how early relationships with caregivers form the blueprint for all future relationships. When your primary caregivers are narcissistic, this blueprint becomes distorted. You develop what psychologists call an insecure attachment style, a deep-seated belief that relationships are unpredictable, that love must be earned through performance, and that abandonment is always lurking around the corner. Your narcissistic parent treated you as what psychologists term a narcissistic extension, not as a separate individual with your own thoughts, feelings and needs, but as a reflection of their own self-image. When you succeeded, they basked in the glory as if it were their own achievement. When you failed or showed independence, you became a threat to their carefully constructed facade of perfection. This dynamic taught you that your value as a person was entirely dependent on how well you served their emotional needs. The result is a profound confusion about your own identity. You learn to scan the emotional atmosphere constantly, becoming hypervigilant to your parents' moods and needs while completely losing touch with your own. This psychological survival mechanism, while necessary in childhood, becomes a prison in adulthood. You find yourself unable to trust your own perceptions, feelings, or judgments. The gaslighting prison. Perhaps nothing breaks you quite like gaslighting, the systematic denial of your reality that makes you question your own sanity. Your narcissistic parent didn't just disagree with you. They made you believe that your memories, perceptions, and feelings were fundamentally unreliable. When you tried to address their hurtful behavior, they responded with phrases that became embedded in your psyche. That never happened. You're too sensitive. You're imagining things. You're the problem here. Gaslighting works because it exploits the natural trust children have in their parents. As psychologist Dr. Stephanie Sarkis explains in her research on gaslighting, children are particularly vulnerable to this form of psychological manipulation because they lack the cognitive development and life experience to maintain confidence in their own perceptions when challenged by an authority figure. Your parents' gaslighting created what psychologists call learned helplessness, a psychological state where you become so accustomed to having your reality denied that you stop trusting your own judgment entirely. You learn to second-guess every feeling, every memory, every instinct. This internal doubt became so pervasive that even decades later, you find yourself apologizing for having needs, questioning whether your hurt feelings are valid, or wondering if you're overreacting to genuinely harmful behavior. The gaslighting didn't just affect specific incidents, it poisoned your entire relationship with truth and reality. You developed a chronic case of what researchers call reality testing deficits, where you consistently defer to others' interpretations of events rather than trusting your own experience. This shows up in your adult life as an inability to trust your own judgment in relationships, career decisions, and even simple daily choices. Emotional neglect and the abandonment of self. While physical abuse leaves visible scars, emotional neglect, the failure to respond to your emotional needs, leaves invisible wounds that can be even deeper. Your narcissistic parent may have provided for your basic physical needs while completely ignoring your emotional world. They were present in body but absent in spirit, leaving you to navigate the complex landscape of childhood emotions entirely alone. Dr. Jonice Webb's Research on Childhood Emotional Neglect, CEN, reveals how this subtle form of abandonment creates lasting psychological damage. When your parent consistently failed to notice, validate, or respond to your feelings, you internalize the message that your emotions didn't matter. You learn to suppress your needs, minimize your pain, and present a facade that wouldn't disturb your parent's self-absorption. This emotional abandonment taught you to abandon yourself. You became expert at detecting and meeting everyone else's needs, while remaining completely disconnected from your own. The child who should have learned that feelings are information, that emotions are valid, and that needs deserve attention, instead learned that emotional expression is dangerous, that vulnerability leads to rejection, and that self-sufficiency is the only path to safety. Years later, you find yourself in relationships where you give endlessly while receiving little in return. You struggle to identify your own feelings, often experiencing a vague sense of emptiness or numbness, where emotions should be. When others ask what you want or need, you draw a blank. Not because you're selfless, but because you were trained to view your own desires as irrelevant or threatening. The parentification trap. Your narcissistic parent didn't just neglect your emotional needs, they often forced you to meet theirs. This role reversal, called parentification by psychologists, occurs when children are burdened with responsibilities and emotional labor that should belong to adults. You became your parent's therapist, confidant, emotional regulator, and sometimes even their parent. Perhaps your mother confided in you about her marital problems, making you her emotional spouse. Maybe your father expected you to manage his rage, walking on eggshells to prevent his explosions. You might have been responsible for your parents' happiness, their self-esteem, or even their basic functioning. This psychological burden was far too heavy for a developing mind to carry. Parentification robs you of your childhood while teaching you that your value lies in what you can provide for others. You learn to be hyper-responsible, hyper-vigilant, and hyper-focused on others' needs. The concept of receiving care, support, or nurturing became foreign to you, not because you didn't need it, but because your role was always to give. Alice Miller, a renowned psychologist who studied narcissistic family dynamics, described how parentified children develop a false self, a persona designed to meet their parents' needs while their authentic self remains hidden and underdeveloped. This false self becomes so practiced, so automatic, that you lose touch with who you really are beneath the caretaking role. In adulthood, you find yourself attracted to relationships that replicate these familiar dynamics. You gravitate toward people who need rescuing, fixing, or emotional regulation. You mistake intensity for intimacy, and confuse being needed with being loved. The exhaustion you feel isn't just from current relationships, it's the cumulative weight of decades spent carrying emotional responsibilities that were never yours to bear. The scapegoat and golden child dynamics. Many narcissistic families operate with a rigid caste system where children are assigned specific roles that serve the narcissistic parent's needs. You may have been designated as the scapegoat, the family member blamed for all problems, failures, and tensions. Or perhaps you were the golden child, placed on a pedestal and expected to reflect your parents' superiority. Some children alternate between these roles, never knowing which version of themselves will be acceptable on any given day. As the scapegoat, you became the repository for all the family's dysfunction. Every argument, every disappointment, every failure was somehow traced back to you. Your parent projected their own shame, inadequacy, and self-hatred onto you, convincing not just themselves, but often other family members that you were the source of all problems. This psychological projective identification, as described in psychoanalytic theory, allowed your parent to maintain their grandiose self-image by externalizing all negative qualities onto you. The constant blame and criticism didn't just hurt your feelings, it fundamentally altered your self-concept. You internalize these messages, developing what psychologists call a negative core belief system. Deep down, you came to believe that you were fundamentally flawed, that you caused problems wherever you went, and that you deserved the poor treatment you received. If you were the golden child, your experience was different but equally damaging. Your parents' love and approval came with impossible conditions. You had to be perfect, successful, and eternally grateful for their investment in you. You learned that your worth was contingent on achievement, that any failure would result in the withdrawal of love, and that your primary purpose was to make your parent look good. The golden child role creates its own psychological prison. You developed what researchers call performance-based self-esteem, where your sense of worth fluctuates wildly based on external validation. You became addicted to achievement not for its own sake, but as a desperate attempt to maintain the love and approval that could be withdrawn at any moment. The erosion of boundaries. Healthy families teach children about boundaries, the invisible lines that separate one person from another, that distinguish your feelings from someone else's, and that protect your autonomy and individuality. Narcissistic parents systematically destroy these boundaries, treating their children as extensions of themselves rather than separate individuals. Your physical boundaries were violated through inappropriate physical contact, intrusions into your privacy, or complete disregard for your bodily autonomy. Your emotional boundaries were trampled as your parent demanded access to your inner world while sharing inappropriate details about their own life. Your psychological boundaries were demolished as your parent told you what to think, feel, and believe, never allowing you to develop your own sense of self. This boundary violation creates what psychologists call enmeshment, a psychological fusion where you can't tell where you end and your parent begins. You absorbed their emotions as if they were your own, took responsibility for their feelings, and lost the ability to maintain a separate sense of self in their presence. The absence of healthy boundaries in childhood creates profound confusion in adulthood. You struggle to know where you end and others begin. You take on other people's emotions as if they were your own, feeling responsible for everyone's feelings and reactions. You have difficulty saying no, setting limits, or protecting your own space and energy. The concept of having rights, to privacy, to your own feelings, to your own choices, feels foreign and selfish. The trauma bond. The relationship with your narcissistic parent wasn't consistently abusive. It was intermittently reinforcing, which created an even stronger psychological bond. This pattern, known as trauma bonding or Stockholm syndrome, occurs when periods of abuse are followed by moments of kindness, creating a powerful psychological addiction to the relationship. Your parents' occasional moments of warmth, attention, or approval became more precious than gold because they were so rare. These intermittent reinforcements created what behavioral psychologists call a variable ratio schedule of reinforcement, the most addictive pattern of behavior modification. Like a gambler at a slot machine, you became addicted to the possibility of winning your parents' love, always hoping that the next interaction might be the one where they finally see and value you. This trauma bond doesn't disappear when you become an adult. You find yourself drawn to relationships that replicate this pattern of intermittent reinforcement. You mistake the intensity of trauma bonding for love, confusing the anxiety of inconsistent treatment with passion. You may find yourself unable to leave relationships that mirror your childhood dynamics, even when you consciously recognize how harmful they are. The trauma bond also keeps you psychologically connected to your narcissistic parent long into adulthood. Despite years of evidence that they cannot provide the love and validation you crave, part of you continues to hope, to try, to seek their approval. This isn't weakness. It's the natural result of a powerful psychological conditioning that began before your brain was fully developed. The development of complex PTSD, the chronic ongoing trauma of narcissistic parenting, often results in what psychologists call complex post-traumatic stress disorder, CPTSD. Unlike PTSD, which typically results from a single traumatic event, CPTSD develops from repeated exposure to trauma over an extended period, particularly during childhood when the brain is still developing. Your symptoms might not look like the flashbacks and nightmares associated with traditional PTSD. Instead, you experience emotional dysregulation, difficulty managing intense emotions that seem to come from nowhere. You might have problems with dissociation, feeling disconnected from your body or your emotions during times of stress. Your sense of self might feel fragmented or inconsistent, changing dramatically based on who you're with or what situation you're in. Dr. Judith Herman, who pioneered research on complex trauma, identified 3 core areas of damage: dysregulation of emotions and impulses, negative self-concept, and interpersonal difficulties. These symptoms aren't character flaws. They're the natural psychological adaptations to an impossible childhood situation. The hypervigilance you developed as a child, constantly scanning for signs of your parents' mood, potential criticism, or emotional needs, continues into adulthood as chronic anxiety. Your nervous system remains stuck in a state of high alert, waiting for the next psychological attack. This constant state of stress takes a tremendous toll on your physical and emotional health. The intergenerational transmission of trauma. Perhaps one of the most heartbreaking aspects of narcissistic abuse is how it perpetuates itself across generations. Your narcissistic parent was likely raised by narcissistic parents themselves, creating a cycle of trauma that spans generations. This doesn't excuse their behavior, but it helps explain how these destructive patterns become so entrenched in family systems. You carry within you not just your own trauma, but the unresolved trauma of previous generations. Family systems theory explains how emotional patterns, coping mechanisms, and relationship dynamics are passed down through families like genetic traits. The anxiety, depression, and relationship difficulties you experience may be connected to traumas that occurred before you were even born. This intergenerational transmission occurs through what researchers call epigenetic changes, alterations in gene expression that can be passed to future generations. Studies have shown that trauma can literally change the way genes are expressed, affecting not just the trauma survivor, but their children and grandchildren. You may be carrying the biological imprint of traumas you never directly experienced. Breaking this cycle requires tremendous courage and conscious effort. It means not just healing your own wounds, but also refusing to pass these patterns on to the next generation. Whether or not you have children, you have the opportunity to be the generation that says no more, that chooses healing over repeating familiar patterns. The path forward, recognition and recovery. Understanding how narcissistic parents break their children isn't meant to leave you feeling hopeless, it's meant to provide a roadmap for healing. When you can identify the specific ways your development was derailed, you can begin the work of getting back on track. Recognition is the first step toward recovery. The good news is that the human brain maintains neuroplasticity throughout life, the ability to form new neural pathways and change established patterns. The psychological wounds inflicted by narcissistic parenting are deep, but they are not permanent. With proper support, therapy, and commitment to healing, you can develop the secure attachment, healthy boundaries, and authentic self-worth that should have been your birthright. Recovery involves grieving the childhood you never had, the parents you needed but didn't receive, and the person you might have been without these early wounds. This grief is necessary and healing. It honors your experience while making space for who you're becoming. You deserve relationships based on mutual respect, genuine care, and unconditional positive regard. You deserve to take up space, to have needs, to express feelings, and to be valued for who you are rather than what you provide. The journey toward healing is challenging, but it's also an act of profound courage and self-love. Your narcissistic parent may have broken important parts of you, but they could not break your fundamental capacity for growth, healing, and connection. That remains intact, waiting for you to reclaim it. The work is hard, but you're worth it. Not because of what you achieve or whom you please, but simply because you exist. That truth, which was hidden from you in childhood, becomes the foundation upon which you can build a life of authenticity, connection, and genuine self-worth. The destruction of authentic self-expression. One of the most insidious ways narcissistic parents break their children is through the systematic suppression of authentic self-expression. From an early age, you learned that showing your true self, your genuine interests, opinions, emotions, or personality traits was dangerous. Your parent couldn't tolerate anything about you that didn't serve their image or emotional needs. Perhaps you were naturally artistic, but your parent dismissed creativity as impractical or attention-seeking. Maybe you were sensitive and empathetic, but these qualities were mocked as weakness. You might have had strong opinions or a questioning nature, but independent thinking was labelled as defiance or disrespect. Whatever made you uniquely, was either ignored, criticised, or actively discouraged. This suppression of authenticity creates what psychologist Dr. Alice Miller called soul murder, the killing of a person's true self to maintain the parent's psychological equilibrium. You learn to perform a version of yourself that was acceptable, safe, and non-threatening to your parent's fragile ego. This performance became so habitual that you lost touch with who you really were beneath the mask. The psychological concept of false self, developed by object relations theorist Donald Winnicott, explains how children adapt to inadequate parenting by developing a compliant exterior while their true self goes into hiding. Your false self became expert at reading the room, anticipating needs, and morphing into whatever version of yourself seemed most likely to earn approval or avoid punishment. Years later, you find yourself struggling with identity confusion that goes beyond normal self-discovery. You may feel like you're living someone else's life, making choices based on what others expect rather than what you truly want. The question, "Who am I?" becomes paralyzing because your authentic self was buried so deeply for so long that excavating it feels impossible. This loss of authentic self-expression also manifests in your relationships. You become a chameleon, automatically adjusting your personality to match what you think others want from you. You struggle with decision-making because you've been so conditioned to prioritize others' preferences that you can't access your own. The idea of disappointing someone or being disliked feels catastrophic, because your survival once depended on maintaining approval. The weaponization of shame. Shame differs from guilt in crucial ways that your narcissistic parent exploited. Guilt says, "I did something bad," while shame says, "I am bad." Your parent used shame as a primary tool of control, teaching you that your very existence was problematic, burdensome, and fundamentally flawed. Dr. Brené Brown's research on shame reveals how this toxic emotion becomes a lens through which you view yourself in the world. Your parent didn't just criticize your behavior, they attacked your character, your worth, and your right to exist as you are. Messages like, "You're so selfish," "Why can't you be more like your sister?" or "You always ruin everything," became the internal voice that narrates your life. This shame-based identity creates what psychologists call toxic shame, a persistent feeling that you are inherently defective. Unlike healthy shame, which motivates positive behavior change, toxic shame becomes part of your core identity. You don't just feel ashamed of something you did, you feel ashamed of who you are. The neurobiological impact of chronic shame is profound. Studies using brain imaging have shown that shame activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. Your brain literally experiences emotional shame as a form of injury, triggering fight or flight responses that keep you in a constant state of stress and hypervigilance. This weaponized shame shows up in your adult life as perfectionism, people-pleasing, and an inability to accept compliments or recognize your own accomplishments. You may sabotage success because deep down, you don't believe you deserve good things. The shame voices that once belonged to your parent have become internalized, creating a harsh inner critic that's often more brutal than any external criticism you face. The destruction of emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence, the ability to recognize, understand, and manage emotions, should have been developed through countless interactions with emotionally attuned caregivers. Instead, your narcissistic parent's emotional dysregulation and lack of empathy created an environment where emotional intelligence couldn't properly develop. Your parent's emotions were unpredictable, intense, and often inappropriate to the situation. You learn to become hypervigilant to their emotional states while completely losing touch with your own. This created what psychologists call emotional dysregulation, difficulty identifying, understanding, and managing your own feelings. The concept of alexithymia, literally meaning no words for emotions, describes the difficulty many adult children of narcissistic parents experience in identifying and expressing feelings. You might experience physical sensations, tension, nausea, fatigue, without connecting them to emotional states. Or you might feel overwhelmed by emotions that seem to come from nowhere, unable to trace them to their source or understand their message. Your parent also failed to teach you emotional boundaries, the difference between your feelings and theirs. Through a process called emotional contagion, you absorb their anxiety, anger, depression, and fear as if these emotions were your own. This left you vulnerable to being emotionally hijacked by others throughout your life, taking on their emotional states without realizing it. The lack of emotional attunement from your parent also impaired your ability to self-soothe, to calm yourself when distressed. Healthy parents co-regulate with their children, helping them return to emotional balance when upset. Without this foundation, you never learned internal regulation strategies, leaving you dependent on external sources for emotional stability. The violation of developmental stages. Child development occurs in predictable stages, each building on the previous one. Your narcissistic parent's inability to provide age-appropriate support and boundaries disrupted this natural progression, leaving you with developmental arrests that continue to affect you as an adult. Erik Erikson's stages of psychosocial development show how children need to successfully navigate each developmental crisis to build psychological health. In infancy, you needed to develop basic trust versus mistrust. If your parent was inconsistent, emotionally unavailable, or frightening, you developed a fundamental mistrust of the world and relationships. During toddlerhood, you should have developed autonomy versus shame and doubt. This is when children learn they are separate individuals with their own will and capabilities. Narcissistic parents often can't tolerate their child's growing independence, responding to normal developmental autonomy with criticism, control, or abandonment threats. Instead of healthy independence, you developed shame about your own needs and capabilities. The preschool years should bring initiative versus guilt, the ability to make plans, tackle tasks, and face challenges. If your attempts at initiative were consistently criticized or controlled, you learn to feel guilty about your own desires and ambitions. This shows up in adult life as difficulty setting goals, starting projects, or pursuing your own interests. School age brings industry versus inferiority, developing competence and confidence in abilities. Narcissistic parents often undermine this development through excessive criticism, impossible standards, or complete lack of interest in their child's achievements. You may struggle with feelings of incompetence despite evidence of your capabilities. These developmental disruptions don't just disappear in adulthood. You may find yourself struggling with issues that should have been resolved decades earlier. Basic trust in relationships, confidence in your own abilities, or the right to have needs and pursue goals. The creation of learned helplessness. Psychologist Martin Seligman's research on learned helplessness explains how repeated exposure to uncontrollable negative events teaches organisms to stop trying to escape, even when escape becomes possible. Your childhood with a narcissistic parent was filled with situations where nothing you did could consistently earn love, approval, or safety. You tried being perfect, but perfection was never enough. You tried being invisible, but that brought criticism for being withdrawn. You tried meeting their needs, but their needs were bottomless pits that could never be filled. You tried asserting yourself, but that brought punishment. Eventually, you learned that your actions didn't matter, that you were powerless to influence your parents' treatment of you. This learned helplessness becomes a lens through which you view all of life's challenges. You may give up too easily, assuming that effort is pointless. You might stay in harmful situations longer than necessary because you don't believe you have the power to change them. The idea that you could influence outcomes through your choices feels foreign and unlikely. The neurobiological basis of learned helplessness involves changes in brain structure and function. Chronic stress and trauma alter the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for executive functioning and decision-making. The amygdala, your brain's alarm system, becomes hyperactive, while the hippocampus, crucial for memory formation, can actually shrink under chronic stress. These brain changes mean that learned helplessness isn't just a psychological state. It's a neurobiological reality that affects your ability to think clearly, make decisions, and take effective action. Recovery involves not just changing thought patterns, but actually rewiring your brain through new experiences of agency and effectiveness. The destruction of future orientation. Healthy child development includes the gradual building of future orientation, the ability to plan, set goals, and work toward long-term objectives. This capacity requires a basic sense of safety and predictability in the present. When your childhood was characterized by chaos, unpredictability, and chronic stress, your brain learned to focus entirely on immediate survival rather than future planning. Your narcissistic parent's emotional volatility created an environment of chronic uncertainty. You never knew which version of your parent you would encounter. the loving, attentive one, or the critical, rejecting one. This unpredictability kept your nervous system in a constant state of hypervigilance, scanning for immediate threats rather than planning for the future. The psychological concept of time perspective explains how trauma affects the way people relate to past, present, and future. Children from narcissistic families often develop what researchers call a present fatalistic time perspective, a focus on immediate needs combined with a belief that the future is predetermined and unchangeable. This shows up in adult life as difficulty with long-term planning, chronic procrastination, or a sense that working toward goals is pointless. You might find yourself living paycheck to paycheck, not just financially but emotionally, unable to build reserves or work toward future satisfaction because you're constantly managing immediate crises. The inability to envision a positive future also affects motivation and hope. If you can't imagine things getting better, why invest effort in change? This hopelessness becomes self-perpetuating, creating the very stagnation that seems to confirm your pessimistic worldview. The impairment of cognitive development. Chronic stress and trauma don't just affect emotional development, they also impair cognitive functioning. The constant state of hypervigilance and fear that characterized your childhood redirected mental resources away from learning, creativity, and intellectual development toward survival and threat detection. Your developing brain was so focused on monitoring your parents' emotional state and adjusting your behavior accordingly that less energy was available for academic learning, creative exploration, or intellectual curiosity. This doesn't mean you're less intelligent. It means your intelligence was redirected towards psychological survival rather than intellectual growth. The concept of cognitive load theory explains how mental resources are limited. When significant cognitive capacity is devoted to managing trauma responses, less is available for other mental tasks. You may have appeared distracted, unfocused, or underachieving in school not because of lack of ability, but because your mental resources were overwhelmed by the demands of psychological survival. Executive functioning, the mental skills that include working memory, flexible thinking, and self-control, is particularly vulnerable to the effects of childhood trauma. These skills, controlled by the prefrontal cortex, don't fully develop until the mid-20s under ideal conditions. Chronic stress can significantly delay or impair this development. As an adult, you might struggle with organization, time management, decision-making, or following through on plans. These aren't character flaws. They're the natural result of a developing brain that was forced to prioritize emotional survival over cognitive development. The destruction of play and joy. Play is not frivolous. It's how children learn about the world, develop creativity, build social skills, and experience joy. Narcissistic parents often can't tolerate their children's natural playfulness because it's not focused on meeting the parent's needs. Your spontaneous expressions of joy, silliness, or carefree behavior may have been criticized as attention-seeking, inappropriate, or disruptive. Dr. Stuart Brown's research on play reveals its crucial role in healthy development. Play teaches flexibility, creativity, empathy, and resilience. It's how children learn to take risks, recover from failure, and experience intrinsic motivation, doing something simply for the joy of it rather than for external rewards. If your play was consistently interrupted, criticized, or redirected toward more productive activities, you missed crucial developmental experiences. You may have learned that joy is selfish, that spontaneity is dangerous, and that you must always be useful to justify your existence. This early suppression of play often results in adult anhedonia, the inability to experience pleasure in activities that should be enjoyable. You might feel guilty about leisure time, struggle to relax, or find yourself constantly busy with productive tasks because rest feels wrong or dangerous. The absence of play also affects creativity and problem-solving abilities. Play teaches flexible thinking, the ability to see multiple possibilities and approach problems from different angles. Without adequate play experiences, you may struggle with rigid thinking patterns, difficulty generating solutions, or fear of making mistakes. Reworking your nervous system. Understanding how narcissistic parenting affects your nervous system is crucial for healing. Your autonomic nervous system, which controls fight, flight, freeze, and fawn responses, was chronically activated throughout childhood. This chronic activation literally rewired your brain and body for survival rather than thriving. Dr. Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory explains how trauma affects the vagus nerve, which regulates your body's stress response system. Chronic childhood trauma can leave your nervous system stuck in states of hyperarousal, anxiety, panic, rage, or hypoarousal, depression, dissociation, and numbness. Your nervous system learned to interpret the world as dangerous, even when you're objectively safe. This means that healing isn't just about changing thoughts or behaviors. It requires literally rewiring your nervous system's responses through practices that promote safety and regulation. Somatic therapies, which focus on the body's role in trauma recovery, recognize that healing must include the nervous system. Techniques like deep breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, yoga, or EMDR can help retrain your nervous system to recognize safety and return to baseline after stress. The good news is that neuroplasticity, your brain's ability to form new neural pathways, continues throughout life. With consistent practice and patience, you can literally rewire your brain for greater emotional regulation, clearer thinking, and more adaptive responses to stress. Breaking the cycle, becoming your own good parent. Perhaps the most powerful aspect of recovery is learning to become the parent to yourself that you never had. This process, called reparenting in therapeutic literature, involves consciously providing yourself with the care, validation, and support that were missing in childhood. Reparenting isn't about regression or childish behavior. It's about healing the wounded child within while strengthening your adult self. It means learning to speak to yourself with kindness instead of criticism, to recognize and meet your own needs, and to provide yourself with the safety and security you've always craved. This process involves developing what psychologists call earned secure attachment, the ability to form healthy relationships despite insecure early attachments. Research shows that people can develop secure attachment patterns through healing relationships, therapy, and conscious self-development work. You can learn to trust your own perceptions, to validate your own feelings, and to make decisions based on your authentic needs and values, rather than fear or people-pleasing. You can develop the emotional intelligence that was never modeled for you, practice setting healthy boundaries, and create the stable, nurturing environment you deserved as a child. This journey isn't easy, and it isn't quick. Healing from narcissistic parenting is a process that unfolds over years, not months. But every step towards self-compassion, every moment of choosing healing over familiar patterns, every boundary you set is an act of profound courage and self-love. You deserved better then, and you deserve better now. The work of healing is how you give yourself what you should have received from the beginning: unconditional love, respect, and the freedom to be authentically, unapologetically yourself.